feel like they have power? Are they aware of the resources available to them? Are they taking advantage of them?
This is a true honor for me.
No, I think you're right. That's probably more
Right. I'm just using your Berkeley mumbo jumbo. I think that's.
I remember I was there 60 years ago, or 50 years ago.
Yeah. I've never met a scientist from there, only social
Yeah, this
scientists.
has all this stuff. So Rob asked me to bring it.
I was there at the end, I stayed the 5th year to
He wanted me to bring it, because it has like all of ours. I don't know.
Does he want to switch it out?
Yeah.
So it was an interesting time. Yeah, it's probably very misunderstood.
No idea, but he asked me to drive up from Mary, so it needs to be set up.
I don't know where you are. Do you want to put it in the hallway? Like right here walking in?
Sure.
Yeah. That's what I was doing.
Are you going back to Concord?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, it's historical. I saw the documentary, Berkeley in the 60s.
will you bring this back and give it to Concord?
Yeah,
Okay. All right, I'll just, I'll set it up out there. Just
Yeah,
bring-
put it right down. Let me set a reminder so I remember to take it down.
Okay, yeah, just give it to Crystal because Charlie's taking it for something tomorrow.
One was free speech, one was the Vietnam War, and one was the leftover of the communist, McCarthy. He was asked to Tommy Card again. I did that in the 40s when I came on. I'm up for 10 years.
You're going to share it. I saw the Twitter thing, Facebook, Instagram. Awesome.
Yeah.
And that created a rift between the regions and the field.
Me too. The difference.
Stop class one day, statistical thing.
Well, when she was talking about the camera, so
Yeah, I rapidly expect that.
Second was the Vietnam War.
none of us have called.
So it's like,
That's proper to.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a lot of people
Too congested, so that's where the vast majority of people came on to campus, the students did. It wasn't the main entry, but that's what people came on campus. And that's where all the card games
You drove all the way up here?
and on public property. You have all the card games. Well, the university, the cities carved out that site. So the people coming down the road could
do it.
Not gonna do it.
Yeah, you're right here.
Okay.
keep the traffic.
Just slap this mic on unless you want to
Then
do
they had
yourself.
the card games.
That would count, because I heard earlier today that you were going to be there, and I knew Sununu was going to be there.
Yes, we can. No, you can't.
And then Jim Lawrence
Where
called
you
me.
gonna put the card?
I said, Jim, you want to
5
talk?
feet here,
We're ready to
5
go.
feet
I feel the same,
He went.
same thing as an actual point of disagreement.
Oh,
with the
perfect.
State of Massachusetts.
district is Hampshire? It's Hudson. New Hampshire is very open.
No, that was not at Hudson.
That was Merrimack.
It was Merrimack.
Is that
That's
first?
me.
That is, sure, but it's like right on the.
But, yes,
It's right over it.
correct.
They don't let you
And
use
there
it.
were
New Hampshire's
equal
not
number
bad.
of,
Town hall.
Yeah, for both.
Massachusetts,
I think
you can't
people
have
from
a
CD1
town
and
hall
CD2.
with political candidates.
That was those
I wasn't
three
sure
issues.
where,
So Reagan was governor over
Merrimack is
there.
Amherst the first?
Amherst is CD2. So I go as far, I go Bedford, Goffstown.
And then-
It's the line over there.
So-
The line is, you would think some of the communities that are CD2 and CD1, just, but based on, how to make it even. But I have Bedford, I have Goffstown, everything else.
And you have a
I don't want to jump in your.
Oh, go ahead.
Going down and going out is all.
It's all CD2, yeah.
Evidence of an audience.
Yep, this will be live on our website in a few minutes.
Okay.
All in control, and we will do this. Corey, Ben, you guys there?
Is Ben talking to me?
No, I think.
Corey, Ben?
We'll be underway in a moment once they tell us.
Yes. Just give them 10 seconds, Brian.
What's that?
Just give them 10 seconds from any time.
Yeah, for the. Hey guys, we are good on our end, so just give me the cue. Yep, we're ready to go on our end. Just give us the cue whenever you need. And then some of this will play Newsmakers this weekend as well. Okay, we are standing by. Or sitting by. We're all sitting by, I guess. Except for Jared and Freddie, they are standing by.
Who would be, did Jim go before?
We had Sean O'Connor just now.
Oh, just now. Good.
Stand by. This is the Fiscal Fridays Festival. I'm NH1 News Political Director Paul Steinhauser, and welcome to the Warren B. Rudman Center at the University of New Hampshire Law School here in downtown Concord. The Fiscal Fridays Festival, it is co-sponsored by NH1 News on WBIN TV, the Concord Coalition, Fix the Debt, and the Warren B. Rudman Center. And this is a nice avenue designed to talk to the candidates for Congress and other elective offices to find out how they stand on the fiscal issues, the issues that matter the most to you. As you can see right now, we are joined by Congressman Frank Guinta, the incumbent, the Republican incumbent in the 1st Congressional District, who is running for re-election. And we are just about 2 or 3 weeks out from Election Day. I know you have a very busy schedule. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Terrific, terrific. Well, let's start off, I guess, the bird's eye view. Where do fiscal issues and cutting the deficit and the debt, where does that stand when it comes to your priorities?
Well, it ranks amongst my highest priorities. I was a business owner and then mayor of our state's largest city, where I focused on trying to be fiscally responsible, not just to the taxpayers of our state's largest city, but to have a long-term economic plan that would produce a greater job opportunity for people in Manchester, as well as economic growth opportunities. And I've continued to play that role as a representative to New Hampshire in Washington, D.C. Served on the Budget Committee in my first term, was asked to return to the Budget Committee about halfway through this term to try to address some of the fiscal challenges that Washington, D.C. is having.
And there are a lot of challenges, no doubt about that. And we're going to get into it. We're going to get specific on Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. We'll talk about tax reform and so on. But let's start with the budget process itself. We're going to have another omnibus this year. We haven't had a normal process the way it was envisioned in many years. How do we get past that? How do we get back to business as usual?
So the budget process is really, I think, somewhat of a frustrating one to most people who have to deal with budgets, whether it's your home budget or a budget within your business, or at a school that you have to deal with a budget. So we have the 1974 Budget Act, which in my view is outdated and needs to be updated. But what happens is the President of the United States will propose his budget. The House Budget Committee will then get to work and has to produce a budget by April 15th. So we literally, on a daily basis, go through each line by line of the budget and produce what we feel are appropriate top line numbers for each area of federal obligations. And then we work with the committees of jurisdiction to talk about the policies within those jurisdictions and where we think dollars should go. But it serves as a bit of a blueprint for how the spending is going to look for the course of that year. Once we unveil the budget, then we go through the appropriations process. And what has happened traditionally is the Congress, the House of Representatives, will get through maybe half, maybe even up to 8 of the 12 appropriations bills. And then for some reason or another, it doesn't continue. The Senate typically doesn't even do any of their appropriations. So this sets up Washington for some sort of omnibus or short-term CR or long-term CR. That is not the way Washington should be spending other people's money.
But it's where we are right now. We are on a CR right now.
Where we are right now. We're on a CR, unfortunately, until December 9th. And that's one of the greatest frustrations that I have, because it's not the way to plan for the upcoming year. And I think people around the country get frustrated because you don't know exactly what the dollar amount is going to be. Now, the only thing about a CR that can be viewed as favorable is that it tends to be level funding. So if you are a fiscal individual who focuses on fiscal issues, and you don't want to see increased spending, the only thing that you would see valuable in a CR is that it tends to be level funding at the existing or current expenditures. That being said, if you're someone like me who wants to prioritize budgeting, you know, every dollar might have different value based on the obligation or responsibility of where that dollar is being spent. You want to be more specific in how you're going to spend money, where you're going to change expenditures. So in the long run, it's not good for the federal government, and it's not good for the people that we represent.
How do we get, let's say you had the authority to fix it, what were the changes you would make? Here at the state level, we have a biennial budget.
Sure. So I do support a biennial budget. I tried to get one passed when I was mayor of Manchester, and I advocated for one at the federal level. What I envision at the federal level with a biennial budget is for year one, you work on the budget for 2 years. You get that adopted. And then year two, you would have oversight obligations. And I always say, imagine if every member of Congress, regardless of party affiliation, would be in year two, which happens to be the year of someone's reelect. They are going through the budget process from an oversight perspective. I think that most members, again, regardless of party affiliation, would identify waste, fraud, abuse, or where dollars are being spent improperly, and then there would be a trigger or mechanism by which you could withhold those resources if not justifiable by the agency head or department head. I think that would do a world of good for fiscal issues, and I think it would do a world of good for the ability to reappropriate as necessary through the course of a budget year.
What's the likelihood of that happening?
Well, I'm talking to my colleagues on the budget committee, and there are a number of different ideas as to how to make the budget process work. This is just one of them, and I have significant support for that. What we ended up doing over the course of this summer, after I got on the committee around April, one of the suggestions I gave to the chairman, Tom Price, was why don't we have budget hearings over the course of the summer about how to change the budgeting process for the future. And he agreed, thought it was a good idea. So we hosted a number of hearings looking at the different options for implementation next year, or an update of the '74 Budget Act. So I anticipate that as we return in November to Washington, in November and December, we will work out what we're looking to unveil in the beginning of the next Congress. But I think it can be a 2-year budget. I think it can be zero-based budgeting, which is essentially, instead of just adding dollars to the existing budget, you just start again from scratch to determine what the priorities are, and they do change from year to year. And I'll give you one example. There are a lot of people having challenges with identifying a good-paying job. Yet we have, on the federal level, across 9 different agencies, about 18 different programs that are job training related. But the metrics and the goals and objectives of each, because they're in different parts of the budget, have different oversight. My feeling is it should be all under the Department of Labor, so you can have one agency that is now following the individual who is looking to get a job or obtain a better job, and utilize those dollars more effectively, match them up essentially to somebody who is out of work for a period of more than 6 months. Those dollars could be better utilized, and you may not have the same administrative cost because it's now one department instead of across multiple agencies. So those are some of the things that I think have to be done and should be done. But that's just good business sense. I think most business people implement those sort of lean approaches to budgeting. As a mayor, I had to do that. Most families have to do that in their home budgets. So I'd like to see those ideas replicated in Washington on behalf of the people that are sending the $3.2 trillion in revenue to Washington, D.C.
I want to move on to a bunch of other things, but quickly, is there bipartisan support for what you're suggesting? Or is this just coming from Republicans?
No, there is. This is, here in New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen has advocated for biennial budgeting. I think it's in part because we in the state of New Hampshire see that it works. And we implement it fairly well at the state level here. When Senator Shaheen was governor, I served in the state legislature at the time, and we have chatted about this particular issue. we feel that it would be good for the federal government. There are other members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, from other states that agree with it as well. So I hope that this continues a movement toward that fiscal approach of being more responsible. By the way, when you're responsible with people's money and you identify where waste, fraud, and abuse is, you can then take those resources back and reallocate them to areas of need without growing the size and scope of the deficit. So that's why I think most Republicans and Democrats agree with let's make sure that we're spending properly. You know, we can have differences of opinion on the policy issue of where we're going to spend, but most of us agree that if there is wasteful spending or inappropriate spending, that should be clawed back and reallocated in a more appropriate manner.
Thank you for the segue, because that's where I want to go next. So let's go from the process to the actual budget itself. And let me throw out a number here. By 2026, the deficit is projected to exceed $1.3 trillion, and the debt is projected to reach 86% of the GDP. That's the highest level since 1947. All right, let's say it's January, you're back in Congress if you get reelected. Where do you see trim? Where can we trim? What departments could go or at least be severely trimmed?
So the most up-to-date numbers for our deficit are about through 10 months of the year is $588 billion. We're tracking higher than we were last year. We were down to about $480 billion. And when I served for my first term back in 2010, you know, we were just over $1 trillion. We had been able to trim that back quite a bit. I believe that you can balance this budget, and I think you can do it in a fairly short period of time.
How?
So there's several areas. We have discretionary and non-discretionary spending on the federal levels. Discretionary are the appropriations bills. Non-discretionary is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, unemployment compensation. On the discretionary side, you can do two things. Tax reform for economic growth and revenue growth. That would take care of some of it. The second component would be, again, the waste, fraud, and abuse, which is about a third of the deficit. And I filed legislation to actually identify where that waste, fraud, and abuse is, have committees of jurisdiction review it, and then be able to rescind those dollars. And then third is spending reductions, just general spending reductions. Now, you can take the approach of an overall 1%, 2%, 3% across the board cut. While I don't think that's the most appropriate way, again, because we want to prioritize, you've got to go into each agency and look at each appropriation and look at what dollars are not being spent properly or what's not constitutional or what's not a federal obligation. There is probably roughly the other third of the deficit, and I think you can get this done. I personally would like to get it done in 2 years. I think most people in DC would like a little more time than that. So I'd be willing to work on a 4-year schedule. But there are people in Washington that want to work on an 8- and 10-year schedule, which essentially means, in my view, you're never going to eliminate the deficit. And if you don't eliminate the deficit, you're not going to address what is now $19.6 trillion in debt, long-term debt. But that is, as you said, going to grow if something is not done differently to change the course of our expenditures. We're taking in $3.2 trillion. We're expending right now roughly $3.6 trillion. On that trajectory, your numbers are correct. We'll be back over $1 trillion in a few years in the deficit. And that just cannot stand. We've got to be fiscally prudent and fiscally responsible.
Before we move on, some specifics. Are there certain departments you'd like to see eliminated or at least severely cut?
You know, I think that you can do, the most appropriate way to address this is to do audits of each and every department, including the Federal Reserve. But let's take the CFPB. The CFPB is off congressional budget based on the approval of the Dodd-Frank Act 5 years ago. They're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, unauthorized by Congress, allowed to do whatever they want because they are under the auspices of Janet Yellen at the Federal Reserve. I don't think that that's appropriate. I mean, a taxpayer really has no say in how that agency is allowed or entitled to use their money. What they have done is spent millions of dollars on renovating buildings in Washington, D.C. so they can have a more palatial place to do their business. They have been, through whistleblowers, identified as an agency that is one of the most political in Washington, D.C., not what I think people would expect of a federal agency. So I would start with curbing their activities and their resources tremendously. Secondly, here in New Hampshire, we believe in local control, regardless of what party you're from. The Department of Education in Washington, D.C. spends about $80–85 billion a year. And my frustration, and I think the frustration I hear from administrators, superintendents, and teachers, is that Washington will place greater and greater regulatory authority and rulemaking on the actual community. And that teacher is now teaching to the obligations of what bureaucrats in Washington are suggesting, rather than allowing that teacher to identify each student in their classroom and create a plan, a specific plan for that particular student. So what I'd like to see relative to the Department of Education is greater flexibility in the resources that, first of all, we send to Washington, and then they send back after they take a cut of it. I'd prefer to keep those resources here, allow communities in the state of New Hampshire to determine what are the best approaches for educational plans for our students.
We got about 10 minutes left, so I got a lot I want to get through. Let's jump into healthcare. And this is an interesting fact. About 1/6 of all the economic activity here in the United States involves healthcare. I think it's fair to say you're not a huge fan of Obamacare, which is known officially as the Affordable Care Act. I think you've said it's anything but affordable, and you say it's top down. What would you replace it with?
So I have voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. I don't think that the right approach is the federal government dictating the kind of health care that individuals should be able to access. And if you remember what the president said at the time, there were two major goals that he had: accessibility and affordability. Well, here in the state of New Hampshire, we're almost down to one carrier. And the carriers that service the exchanges are, for example, Minuteman Health. Not picking on them personally, just using them as an example. I meet with them on a fairly regular basis. Over the summer, their premiums went up about 42%, just this summer. So the affordability for a family of four under the Affordable Care Act in New Hampshire, according to what they're able to provide, is about $300 per person, per family member. So you're talking $1,200 a month. That is not affordable as I see it, and it's not affordable as I think families see it when they're trying to access health care. So what I would do is eliminate that. I would go to a more free market approach where you erase state lines so we can purchase anywhere we want. And I've identified, for example, identical plans, New Hampshire and Arizona, where Arizona is per employee now about $50 per month cheaper. If you think about a small business here in New Hampshire that has 30 to 40 people, $50 per month per individual becomes rather a high savings. You could return that to your business. You could return that in any way you want. Health savings accounts to the individual that works for you. I think health savings accounts need to be expanded. And I think that individuals need to have transparency. For example, when I was mayor of Manchester, we went to the 17 unions, and we didn't legislate this. We worked with them on a volunteer basis. If you or your family member wanted to go, we gave them the price sheet in their PPO and said you can go to the highest expense, the medium, or the lowest. If you choose something other than the highest, we'll share with you, the employee, in that savings. City gets some, the employer, and the employee gets some. All of a sudden, people were engaged in their health care again. The costs started to decline almost immediately to the employer, and the employee had more savings. So anywhere you can influence healthcare from a transparency perspective, you're going to see more engagement from that individual. So depending on who the next president is, will dictate what happens with the Affordable Care Act. If it's a president who wants to eliminate it, you'd create a bridge to make sure that people who are receiving benefits under the Affordable Care Act wouldn't be left out in the cold. They would have a certain period of time to get back onto a private carrier. But then you're going to have safety nets, as we used to in the state of New Hampshire, for those who are most vulnerable. And you'd have a portion of Medicaid pay for those resources and those needs, as we have had in the past. But again, I think here in New Hampshire, we have to create an environment where there's greater competition. We cannot just have one carrier in the state of New Hampshire that just doesn't serve any of the employers or individuals well in terms of choice and in terms of cost.
And you brought up those people. There are about 50,000, I believe, right now in the state of New Hampshire that get their health care through the exchanges. Medicaid expansion then should not be expanded anymore.
I think there's a better path to providing affordable care. Again, we used to have a safety net in the state of New Hampshire for any individual who couldn't afford health care, and that was actually working well. The state of New Hampshire could have done a better job of making sure that anyone who didn't have access to affordable health care would be part of that high-risk pool. And I think that that can continue to work, and I think there can be greater savings. When you look at Medicaid expansion, the two greatest concerns, I think, at the federal level and the state level are the cost and where are the resources going to come from. The federal government has said that it's not going to pay 100% of that Medicaid expansion resources. The state of New Hampshire is going to have to pick that up. What I'd rather do is give the state of New Hampshire greater flexibility, create their own high-risk pool, and manage it as they see fit, as opposed to being beholden to the federal government.
Let's move to Social Security. And we all know that it faces insolvency, maybe as soon as 2034. And a question from the audience here is, would you work with the next president and Congress to ensure Social Security stays strong, both to protect the current and future retirees and to protect small businesses in our state that make the backbone of the New Hampshire economy?
So the short answer is yes. The longer answer is I've been trying to do that. In my first term, we worked with a plan that was actually, most people didn't realize this, but the plan that came out of the Budget Committee at the time that was called the Ryan Plan, that got very political, was a plan that was adopted by then President Bill Clinton. We then worked with Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat, to try to get greater bipartisanship, because I do have the goal and objective of preserving and protecting Social Security. We don't want to see any cuts for existing seniors or anyone who is near retirement. I don't think that's fair or right or justified, particularly when someone is planning on those resources for their retirement. And by the way, people pay into it. So rightfully so, they feel that there should be a solvent program available for their needs in their retirement, and I agree with that. But the reality is, this issue is not going to be solved by Democrats only or by Republicans only. We are going to have to find common ground in divided government, and it's very possible that you'll have divided government in the next term. And who knows what's going to happen in November, on November 8th, but people seem to think more and more the likelihood of a divided government is possible. So Republicans and Democrats are going to have to get together and find the path to solvency. And the example that I continue to use is how I've worked with Annie Custer here from CD2. I'm a Republican, she's a Democrat, on the heroin and opioid crisis. I'm the chairman of the committee. I asked her to be my co-chair, which is something that typically doesn't get done in Washington, D.C. But we wanted to set the tone that if not on the heroin crisis, then what are we going to be bipartisan about? We have almost 90 members equally divided amongst Republicans and Democrats on that task force. And I think that can serve as an opportunity to deal with other controversial or challenging issues that we have to solve bipartisanly, like how we're going to fund Medicare, like how we're going to fund Medicaid, like Social Security. That's been the third rail of politics for most people, and I completely disagree. You've got to head these issues face on. You've got to talk to your constituents, inform people what's on the table and what the challenges are, and then produce a solution that's beneficial to Americans here, not just in New Hampshire, but around the country.
Got 2 minutes left, so I want to get a couple more things in quickly. I'll stick with Social Security. We've heard a lot about means testing. We've heard about raising the retirement age. Good ideas, bad ideas?
I think every idea needs to be on the table in terms of a negotiation and what's best for the country. You don't want to take anything off the table from the outset. But I do think that a program that recognizes people are living longer makes sense. When Social Security was first instituted, the notion of how long you're going to live was much shorter. Your age expectancy was around 65, 67.
So you're open to raising the age?
I'm open to it, not for existing seniors or anyone near retirement. I'm open to that for people who have 30 and 40 years in the workforce that expect to live, at that point, close to 100 years old.
Hate to do this, but tax reform in 1 minute, less than 1 minute. Current rates, change them?
Change them. On the business side, we have the highest rate in the country at 35%. We're losing jobs as a result of that. So we should repatriate. First of all, I had the repatriation bill. That would bring in hundreds of millions of dollars, which is another way to solve the existing deficit. Bring that 35 rate down to 15. On the individual side, we had 6, now we have 7 rates. You've got to simplify it. We've got to get down back to, I think, around 3 rates, reduce taxes for the middle class, make sure that they can keep more of their hard-earned money, and I think you would see economic output go from the 1% we're at today to about 4 to 5%. That's going to also solve the deficit.
Not bad. Tax reform in about 45 seconds right there. So thank you very much. You've been watching the Fiscal Fridays Festival. It is co-sponsored by NH1 News and WBIN TV, the Concord Coalition, Fix the Debt, and the Warren B. Rudman Center. That's where we are right now, the New Hampshire School of Law in beautiful downtown Concord. And we have been joined by the incumbent Republican Congressman in the 1st District, Frank Guinta. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks. It's always good to be back in my alma mater.
And we are clear.
Okay.
Excellent.
Good. That fast.
Yeah. All right. Congressman, thank you very much. I'm sure I'll see you on the campaign trail.
I suspect you will.
Take care.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay.
You don't care about 2 minutes?
Well, that's what